What people don't realize at the same time is that if I don't learn how to let go and how to teach people how to perform independently, it will be impossible for me, and I really mean it will be impossible to create a high-performing team.
This is Melanie.
And this is Christian.
You're listening to Follow the Gradient, the weekly podcast with actionable insights about how to build a business while staying sane.
Welcome to another episode of our Follow the Gradient podcast. I think that the guest we are talking to today and the topic he is sharing insights on really came close to our heart. And this has really been a conversation we have listened to very closely, simply because we had so many personal experiences on the topic he discussed. Many startups experience a good amount of growth in a short period of time. And with that growth come opportunities for the people working there to take on bigger responsibilities and opportunities to lead a team, essentially to transition from an individual contributor to a manager. And this does not only apply to operators. It does obviously apply to founders as well, who start out as this 2-person, 3-person or 4-person show and then move on to raise a seed or Series A and all of a sudden need to lead teams of 10, 20, 50 or 100 people.
Yes, and this is where many managers struggle. I've used to struggle with this myself. I remember vividly the moment when I had to shift my mindset from delivering the best performance myself to figuring out how to lead a team of 5, 10, or even 15 people to deliver great results together. You ask yourself, how do you inspire them? How do you delegate effectively and trust that they'll get the job done well, even if it's not exactly how you would have done it? How do you give constructive feedback in a way that empowers rather than discourages them? A book that helped me personally a lot is Radical Candor from Kim Scott. So today we're thrilled to explore these very challenges with Stanislaw Grunstein. Stanislaw is the founder of CNTRD, an expert in leadership, organizational psychology, and behavioral change. Stanislaw coaches and consults managers to become leaders and empowering them to put people first and drive transformative results within their organizations. Building a company is all about leadership, about building, maintaining, and fostering relationships. So many people try to do this. So many people fail. Today, Stanislaw shares his insights on why your mindset is the key baseline for taking a leadership role, how to manage the fear of letting go and use delegation to build high-performing teams, how to effectively provide feedback and use this as a tool to empower your team, and why creating intrinsic motivation is essential.
Stanislav's perspective on how to tackle things like feedback and delegation were one of a kind, and we wished we would have benefited from these insights earlier. With over 15 years of experience across 25 countries, he helps managers cultivate human-centered leadership cultures. His coaching record covers sessions with hundreds of executives and managers worldwide on team management, leadership psychology, and cultural transformation. He's an active lecturer in Germany and Israel and an advisor to several international research collectives.
So without further ado, let's dive in.
Stanislaw, welcome to the show. Could you start by sharing a bit about your background and what motivates you to coach others into becoming effective leaders?
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. In fact, the motivation started long before I became an organizational psychologist and went into leadership development. I was always, I believe since I'm a child, I was always amazed by the depth of human behavior and motivation. And I was driven by two fascinating, I believe at least fascinating questions. The first one was, why do we actually do what we do? And the second one, maybe even more important, is how to get other people to do what we want them to do. How do we really impact others? How do you take action to influence emotions, thoughts, and obviously ultimately the behavior of other people? Isn't that fascinating? So when I started working in and with organizations, I realized that there is this huge gap between how we interact outside of work versus how we interact within our offices. So we are it seems to me at least, we are these incredibly complex social beings, highly attuned to the needs and the expressions of people around us. And we know how to build partnerships and friendships and families and football clubs and all that jazz. And yet, we seem to struggle with the same meaningful relationships at work, and most importantly, with our direct reports. And at the same time at work, we spend most of our lives. If we look at the numbers are actually staggering. We're talking about some 85% of Western knowledge workers self-reporting that they're either disengaged or very disengaged at work. Right? So imagine what that means. It means that more than 8 out of 10 people are probably around you, right? We're all kind of in the Western part of this world. They kind of get up in the morning and don't really want to go to work. So they really couldn't care less about their interactions at work, about what it is that they actually have to deliver, not their execution, but what stands behind it. And those people are dissatisfied at best and frustrated at worst. And we're talking about people like you and me, right? People who go home to their partners, friends, families. What a tragedy. What a tragedy. So at some point I realized that has to change. And I really want to play a part in that. So for me, really, it's more than fixing work cultures, if you want. It's larger than that. It's about really improving the quality of life for, well, hopefully one day millions of people.
This is a crazy number that you just dropped. Impressive. When we are talking about the bubble we are in, the startup bubble, what key leadership challenges do you see today, particularly when working with startups? What do people most struggle with?
So I would say, if you wanted me to create a short list, I'd say that there are 2 challenges that are probably most pressing and that I see, I don't want to say on a daily basis, but for sure on a weekly basis. And first and foremost, by the way, not only in startups, but throughout organizational formats, that is creating engagement within teams. How do I motivate? How do I drive performance intrinsically? How do I make sure that my team members actually want to hit their goals, right? They want to hit their goals, not because I'm the boss and I tell them what to do, but because they are driven to actually hit the numbers, achieve their goals, to develop, to grow. And that has everything to do with building deeply meaningful relationships at work. Particularly in startups, however, there is this other pressing pain point, and that is changing, really transforming the mindset from an individual contributor to that of a people leader. And that is something that I see in virtually every single startup I work with. The story behind it is quite straightforward. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Who's promoted into managerial roles when a startup grows? Well, obviously the people who are best at what they do. So once they're promoted, however, their role description changes dramatically. So out of a sudden, they're not paid anymore to deliver the best results. They're paid to get their team to deliver the best results. And no one really ever got trained to do that. If you started in a startup and you got promoted, you kind of left alone to deal with those challenges. And the challenges in terms of execution are large enough, but changing your mindset, really looking at the same reality through a different pair of eyes, if you want, really stepping aside and looking at the same challenges from a different perspective, that's incredibly challenging.
And on that point, as you said, there is often no clear career ladder in startups, and you're quickly thrown into these leadership roles without knowing what to do and how to do it. And you start out as an individual contributor, then you hire team members, you hire team leads, you hire experts which are more experienced than you yourself. What advice would you give to a first-time leader to excel in this kind of environment?
Yeah, well, that's a great question because it really follows up on what we just mentioned, right? It's to really understand and to really deeply internalize that your new job is fundamentally different from the one you had earlier. It's really fundamentally different. It's not just you continuing with business as usual and out of a sudden you have a couple of people sitting next to you. It's really internalizing that your job is not to be the best performing guy or girl in your team anymore. That really is not what matters. What matters is whether you're able to enable your team to produce an output that is several times better than what you could have ever achieved by yourself, right? And as high level as this might sound, this is paramount. Mindset always comes before action. Always before action. So kind of the best one bullet point advice for first leader is to internalize that your number one priority on a daily basis should be to enable your team to fulfill and harvest their full potential. Got to become and wanting to become their mentor, their advisor, their coach if you want. You have to, and that's a phrase I mention often, you have to be obsessed with their performance, not with yours. And, to someone who might be a little bit more self-aware and to someone who has been in leadership positions for a while, it sounds very obvious. But trust me, it's not obvious at all. And I don't want to play a blame game here, God forbid, right? It's not about saying that people are not thinking about it. I just simply believe that people are too busy. People are too busy. They're not trained to do that. And it's just something that is not part of their very, very large and long list of to-dos and priorities.
And you're hinting exactly in the direction I want to go next. So in your experience, what are the most common mistakes new managers make besides not realizing that they now have another job?
Well, this mindset issue, right? Setting the priorities right is number one. You can talk around it. Now, when we want to go a little bit more on a practical level, and again, if I would need to make a short list, because obviously there are a number of topics we could talk about, but if I have to pick one, it would probably be the fear of letting go. The fear of letting go. So what we mentioned already, right? So especially in startups, people who are promoted or people who most likely were doing an excellent job before their promotion. And if I was doing a great job before I got promoted, chances are incredibly high that I will expect my team members to perform on the same level, right? And that's unfortunately a blessing and a curse, because it's great to have high standards. It's great to set stretch goals and to push your team members. And at the same time, if the expectation is higher than what I coach people to do, if my expectation is high, but I don't know how to communicate it, that will likely lead to one of the two following things. So it's either disappointment among everyone involved, really, me, my direct report, my manager, and so on and so forth. Or even worse, if you ask me, it will lead to the famous, I kind of quickly do it myself philosophy, right? And what people don't realize at the same time is that if I don't learn how to let go and how to teach people how to perform independently, it will be impossible for me. And I really mean it will be impossible to create a high-performing team. And the reason behind it is actually, in fact, quite straightforward as well, because if instead of dedicating time and most importantly, headspace to grow, train, and develop my team, I am using all that time to do things to fix issues myself, I will never have the time to take care of my team. So it's kind of, we very quickly fall into this vicious circle of being way too much involved operationally and way too little involved in developing my team. So this fear of letting go is something I believe we're all familiar with, me, myself included, by the way, top of the list. At the same time, we tend to forget that the opportunity costs are incredibly high.
And it's exactly where I want to dig a little bit deeper, because as we both, Kristen and I, have experienced, we're living and breathing and working in a hyper-growth environment, and we often juggle multiple roles. Sometimes we have to step up and do individual contributions because there are simply not enough people there. But at the same time, we also need to guide people. We need to keep the overall strategy in focus. So how can a leader effectively manage this balancing act? What tools or strategies can help? And also, how can I, as a leader, avoid getting so caught up in the day-to-day business that I basically lose the sight for the bigger picture?
Yeah. So I believe there are two issues here. There are two levels we could talk about. Number one, kind of repeating myself, you got to free up operational time. And I'm really talking about a day-to-day level kind of involvement. I'm not talking about sitting there, end of the year, maybe even end of the quarter, and thinking strategically about the next quarter, the next year, and then delegating a project or two. Talking about operationally on a daily basis, you have to let go and you have to delegate. I always like to say, ideally 100% of your tasks, 100% of your operational tasks. And I'm comfortable to say that because no one is actually doing that, right? So even if we get somewhere in that direction, that'd be excellent. you need the time to focus on the strategies that you just mentioned. But much more important is you got to have the head space. You got to have the head space to really dive into larger topics like strategy, like vision, like development. Those are things that no one else can do for you, right? So you got to be very clear on distinguishing what are the things that I could do probably quite well, but then there are other people who could do it maybe 80% of my level, let's say, maybe even better, who knows? But then there are other things that no one else can do besides me, no one else. And those are the things I need to prioritize. So when we're already talking, and this is the second level I wanted to mention, when we're already talking about topics like vision and strategy for the team or department, by the way, you don't have to be a CEO and you don't have to be a co-founder to talk about strategy and vision. I want every single team lead, head of department, director, you name it, have a strategy and a vision for their team. And I don't care if it's 20 people or 2. Once you hopefully freed up the time and you freed up the headspace to think about these issues, you got to constantly communicate it. Not once in a year, not once a quarter, at least weekly, and ideally embedded within your day-to-day interaction.
You mentioned a very important point, which is delegation, right? And which is one of the hot topics. Leading a team is about distributing tasks among them. So delegation can be very tricky. What mindset should leaders adopt when it comes to effectively delegating tasks?
Yeah, that's a big one. So talking about mindset and delegation, before we talk about delegation itself, right? If you ask me, delegation should always be about delegating ownership, not delegating tasks. And that is a fundamental difference between telling people what to do and keeping the responsibility, having them basically setting them up for, I don't want to say failure, but setting them up for coming back to us every single time they encounter a barrier or an issue or a problem, versus making them feel responsible for a task or a project. And that's what I mean when I talk about delegating ownership, delegating responsibility. We don't want people to execute like robots. We don't want them to come back to us all the time. We don't want to delegate and still have the task, the project within our headspace, right? I mentioned earlier that headspace is significantly more important than simply the time. And I believe this is what a lot of people are not aware of, that delegation is not just pushing tasks off my to-do list. Delegation should ideally be about freeing up my head. And obviously there's significantly more to that. It's not only delegating headspace. When we delegate ownership, what we also do is we train and enable people. We actually grow our team members into independent, small-scale leaders, if you will. We want to delegate ownership so that our team members slowly but surely grow into a role where they can function independently from us. They don't need to get back to us. They need to ask us for permission every single time. But they can walk off and they're entitled and enabled and ideally trained to take decisions themselves, to know how to connect the dots individually, to know where to get resources if they need to, and obviously to come back to us when they need to talk to us, but not as a default fallback option. And I think that is crucial when we're talking about mindset.
And this is exactly where I feel that sometimes it's such a thin line, because especially in the environment where we are, where it's under stress and time pressure and not enough people, and we need to get to that next milestone. It's, yes, I totally am with you. Like, it's about enablement and training, but how do you look upon this trade-off between training someone and doing an ad hoc task on your own? Does it block enablement and delegation when you sometimes also jump in? Or should you just like let it go? How do you do that, like in a practical sense?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the quick answer to that is yes, it does oppose delegating ownership. So if you do jump in, what you're basically communicating is you don't really know how to do that. I'm better. I know more. I do not have the time, the patience to tell you why and how you should do it. Let me just figure it out. Now, we all have been there. right? And don't get me wrong, there are moments when that's the only way to go. Okay. There is this deadline approaching. It's a super important project. The boss of my boss is looking at it and we have to hand it in tomorrow. And obviously I'm going to jump in, right? We're all human and we all have our own pressures behind the cards. Now, we just need to know what that means. And we just need to know that when we do that, we have to kind of make up for it afterwards. We have to engage with this team member that we took the task away from again, just shortly before he or she could actually deliver that result. We have to engage with them in a one-on-one and kind of set things straight again. Because the ramifications, the opportunity costs are very, very long term. We need to understand that every time we do that, our team members are less likely and less incentivized really to take ownership next time. Because what the message that we send in between the lines, and that's the one that is heard loudest, is that next time when I delegate to you, I don't really want to delegate to you. I want you to execute. I want you to do the busy work for me, but I'm going to have an eye on you. And when things go wrong, I'm going to take over. Apart from that, you're also telling people that whenever things hit the wall, whenever you don't know how to progress, I'll always have your back. That's more maybe putting it a little bit more in a positive light, but it won't serve your purpose. It won't serve your purpose of growing and developing independent managers, independent leaders. So to come back to your questions, what do I think about it? Well, of course we do that. And it's okay to do that. And sometimes we have to do it. But we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of the consequences. And we have to look for that human connection. We have to look for that conversation when we're doing it, maybe afterwards, depending on our time frame. We have to tell people why we're doing that and what that means for them.
You mentioned different points on how the person leading a team herself can actually become the bottleneck, right? And can create a situation where they're not able to delegate because they fear they're no longer needed or they lose control. How do you overcome that fear, or how do you overcome that feeling of losing control when you start delegating more and more?
How do you overcome that fear of losing control? The straightforward answer to that really is it's a little bit like learning how to swim. There's no way you can simply talk about it. At some point, you got to step in and you have to delegate at least a little bit of your responsibility. There's really no way around it. Now, as we mentioned earlier, sometimes the stakes are incredibly high, right? Sometimes that project is super important and that deadline is approaching significantly faster than we expected. And we feel this uncomfortable feeling of letting go completely. Maybe the person that we wanted to delegate this project to is a little bit too junior. We don't have the time to train. I get it. You don't have to delegate the whole thing if you're afraid. I mean, maybe you can chop it up, right? Maybe you can delegate a small group of tasks. Maybe you can pick a particular milestone. Maybe you can take over this project, but then you are actively looking for another task, for another project that has less visibility. And that's where you're going to practice. And you have to be comfortable. You have to get comfortable with this project and this particular task not turning out the way you want it to be. Right? That has to be part of the deal. So you are afraid of losing control and you have to play around with it. You have to get your hands wet a little bit, right? And you have to have your team member also deliver results that you will not like so much, but that's okay. Think of it as kind of building your muscle. You have to start somewhere and you have to gradually increase. By the way, the same is true for your team members, right? You can't just throw a large project at a junior employee, right? Give them something, teach them, be there, low visibility, and then scale it up as you progress.
And what I have also seen is the feedback afterwards, or just when they're learning. Like, I can give an example. Once I gave the access to the website to a junior person, and I knew what I was doing. And then a few hours later, the website was down. But I sat down with the junior once we got it up again, and we looked at what has happened, and it never, ever happened again. And I felt this was a very important step, because afterwards I could always rely that this person would know how to deal with it. And this is exactly where I want to go next, about the feedback. I feel that's basically the topic that is so crucial in this whole delegation and leadership part. But what is your thought about it? What do you think? How can this best be done? Like, what should be the objective of giving feedback, and what is a good or bad feedback, maybe?
Yeah, those feedback is the second most important topic, if not the first one, if you want. It's kind of the twin brother of delegation in terms of importance. And feedback is a big deal, right? Feedback is how we get things done if we talk about interaction with our team, right? This is how we navigate our team. This is how we adjust performance. This is how we develop. This is how we debrief after delegation, as you just mentioned. And yet there are way too many misconceptions about it. So what is the reason we give feedback, as you asked, right? So we certainly want to give feedback in order to change a certain situation, right? We want to adjust a certain behavior, we want to improve performance, and so on and so forth. However, what we need to understand is that if our goal is to only change the person's behavior based on what we think we want, we will likely not be as effective as we want it to be. Why? Because when feedback is all about what we want the other person to do, the success of it, the success of the other person actually, leaving and changing their behavior will fully depend whether the person likes us, connects to us, listens to us or not. What if the other person thinks differently? What if the other person simply doesn't like us so much? Right? But then there's a different approach to it. Now, imagine we could give feedback in a way where the other person leaves the room and the other person is motivated to change their behavior because they see the real benefit for themselves. Not because we told them what to do, but because they think it's beneficial to change behavior. Wouldn't that be amazing? Right? And that is what I call feedback for growth. And the missing second component is that when we give feedback, it's not only about what we think the other person should do. That's obviously the starting point. But my question is, can we give feedback in a way that will emphasize the benefit of changing this behavior for the other person? Can we make a big deal what changing the behavior would enable them to do, what it would make possible for them? Maybe it would help them to progress in their career development. Maybe it would help them to hit their own targets. Maybe it would help them to better their position within the team, whatever it is. But if that's going to be my cornerstone, so to speak, of my feedback conversation, I promise you that the other person will walk out of this room feeling that it's more about themselves, more about their own benefit, and less about my boss telling me what he or she thinks I should do. But that requires some work, right? That requires us to sit down, to know the other person, and to think what will drive the other person to change behavior.
If we drill down exactly on this point and think about situations where you don't necessarily want to give exclusively positive feedback, but you need to give or want to give constructive feedback. Maybe you want to communicate a gap between your expectation or the business's expectations and your perceived performance of a team member. So how do you give constructive feedback without damaging motivation?
Really, there are two elements that you simply cannot miss. Number one is feedback has to be always about objectively observable behavior. That's the only thing you can ever give feedback on. Not about what you think the other person did, what you feel happened, what you heard someone else tell you about the performance, and so on and so forth. That will always lead you down a route where you cannot win. So really, objectively observable behavior is the only thing you're going to talk about, because then you have a base. Everything else is your opinion, and your opinion, frankly, might not matter so much for the other person. And the other one, especially since you asked me about not damaging motivation, the second part is what we just discussed earlier, right? Being obsessed with making the conversation about their benefit. Of course, it's going to be you giving feedback to the person, you wanting to adjust their behavior in a certain direction. But can you be smart enough, so to speak, to connect it to a driver that is important for them? Maybe you know that getting promoted in half a year is very, very important to my team member. So maybe it's going to be about that. Maybe it's you showing them how changing their behavior and being better next time when they collaborate with team members can help them get this promotion that they're looking for. Right? And if you manage to really focus the whole conversation around the benefit for them, I don't see how it would negatively impact their motivation. In fact, quite the opposite should be the case. If you make it kind of normal case to make feedback about their benefits and about growth, then you kind of slowly but surely will transition into this mentor role, this advisor role, where people will come back to you for feedback. Imagine how different teams would function when team members will come to their boss to ask more feedback, because feedback will help them develop, and not kind of getting uncomfortable when my manager calls me to a feedback conversation. So that is what we want, right? Giving constructive feedback, not only without damaging motivation, but in fact, while increasing motivation.
And I hear, and I also can confirm that this is the case, if you want to give good feedback and really make sure that you reach the other person on a human level, you also need to take time. It's not between one meeting to the other. Of course, sometimes you need to give that feedback between one meeting to the other, but often you also need to reflect on it. This is one part, but then you sometimes hear about companies where you have a meeting and everyone rates each other. And so it's constant feedback on a daily, on an hourly basis almost. What is your take there? Is it like something that needs to be regular, on spot? What is the best frequency and format to establish a feedback culture?
Yeah, that's a great and so important question. The answer to that, it depends. It really depends. I believe there are different types, different kind of feedbacks, and I would like to distinguish between at least two. One is practical, operational feedback when working together, right? When I have to tell the person how to interact with a certain tool, or we're shortly before the next client pitch, and so on and so forth. So there you have to give feedback on the spot. And in fact, there are companies where peer feedback is given while people sit within the same meeting room. I believe Ray Dalio introduced this feedback method, and it works amazingly. So we know from, I don't know whether people really like it. In fact, I never had the opportunity to talk to someone who works in a company like that, but we know that performance goes up, and we know that kind of the talent pool get denser and denser. However, practical operational feedback should really be given on the spot. There's no point discussing a particular meeting when the conversation is about operational items a week later. Do it straight away and normalize giving feedback on the spot. That's one part of the answer. The second part of the answer, and the second type of feedback, is some sort of higher level feedback, higher level interaction, where it's not just about, solving a particular issue, but it's about the approach to problem solving, for example, or it's about a certain mindset, or it's about a type of engagement you want to talk. I don't think that this should be given kind of in between things, right? Because if that kind of feedback that is higher level is given in between tasks or in between meetings, it will also be conceived as kind of in between, not that important. I believe that type of higher level feedback should be ideally given at least once a week. Okay, let's say you have a not too large team. Let's say we're talking about less than 10 team members on your team. You probably will have short one-on-one sessions with every single one of them. That is your time for feedback. Once a week. Do not let it drag on till your mid-year evaluation conversation. I don't really believe in that thing. So give feedback frequently, give operational feedback on a daily basis, and give higher level feedback for growth, probably at least once a week. That's what one-on-ones are for, right? People get it a little bit wrong, thinking that one-on-one should be about the tasks and the projects. It should be, but at least half of my one-on-one should be about feedback, development, growth.
Feedback should also be given bottom up. In your experience, how do leaders foster a sense of safety where employees feel comfortable providing that type of upward feedback?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, feedback should absolutely be given bottom up. And I also truly believe that a lot of senior managers, a lot of co-founders, C-level executives, they're struggling with not getting enough feedback. On the one hand side, kind of people don't really like to get feedback. On the other hand side, people feel lonely. It's lonely up there. So if you are a senior executive, or in fact, also if you are a middle manager and you want your team members to give you feedback, there are a couple of things you got to do for that. First of all, you need to be the person who is giving a lot of feedback yourself. You got to role model it, right? You cannot expect your team members to give you feedback when you never give feedback to them. That's number one. So be the mentor, don't be the boss, give feedback for growth, give it frequently. Secondly, you got to ask for it. You got to openly speak it out. People will not run into your room with, feedback lists developed or created just for you. You got to ask for it. You might want to even make it a condition for your one-on-one, once a month, once every 2 weeks. Ask very specific questions and ask them to bring at least one idea in your one-on-one. Right? You have to make it kind of a prerequisite. Can you please, in 2 weeks, can you please come back? And I would really love to hear your thoughts on, my performance, X, Y, that. Can you please bring at least one thought? I would be really interested. It has to come with the sense of, I'm curious to hear what you're thinking. And then once they actually step up and give you feedback, that's your money time. You got to be there, right? You got to listen actively and you got to praise them for having the courage to speak up. If they come to you and they give feedback and all you do is you argue and you justify and you're not really present, well, why should they ever come again? Right? Chances are high they won't. So when they step up, you got to be there and you got to be all in.
100%. This is also how I lived through it. You need to be there and you need to listen. And even if you don't agree, it's still their opinion and it's still very, very valuable. And that should be appreciated always. Otherwise, it will never come back. And this brings me to our last topic about also engagement, because in the end, this shows also our discussion that we just had. We're all humans. We need to feel motivated. We need to feel passionate. We need to be feeling safe. This is engaged. So engaged about the work we do. And so employee engagement is a major challenge for many leaders. What's your approach to driving engagement in teams?
Yeah, so engagement is really this big hashtag word, right? So blogs are filled with it and research papers are filled with it and it's just thrown around in office halls. Now, we can certainly, by the way, and we also should talk about those classic engagement drivers, right? We can talk about money and title and development and purpose. Purpose is another hashtag word, right? And group dynamics and so forth. So the list is kind of long and it's important to talk about it. But then there is another fundamental driver. And I feel because this fundamental driver is not so businessy, I'd say, that we simply don't talk about it. And that is care. That is care. I can pay you a very high salary and I can give you a very fancy title. And I can talk about how we're going to change the world all day long. But I promise you that if you don't feel that I care about you, and if you don't feel that I value your interests and that I care for what you care about, that's probably the most important one. You won't be motivated to perform. You'll do your job and you might even do your job well because, you might be someone who's performing well, but you won't be engaged. You won't go the extra mile. You will not be proactive in the way that I want you to be. The proof for that is in our daily interactions outside of work. Think of your interactions with, your best friend, with your partner, with your children. They're not paying you for it, right? They're not giving you any fancy title, but yet you're kind of driven to engage with them. You're driven to help them to do what they ask you for. And all of this simply because we care about them. And in very, very simple terms, we care about them because they care about us. Care is double-sided. So I kind of wanted to use this question to kind of bring that in, right? Because we could jump straight away to those motivational drivers that are super important. I'm not playing them down at all. But we need to understand that apart from status, title, and money and purpose, there are motivational drivers that are built in our human interactions, even when we don't work in high tech or when we don't work at all. That's very, very important. We cannot neglect it just because it's a little bit less, less businessy, less fancy to talk about.
When we talk about motivation, we often hear people say there is internal and external motivation. And one thing is that you might be driven by a purpose. And the other thing is that you are driven by someone else's pressure. So with that regard, what are, in your perspective, the most effective motivational drivers for employee engagement?
Yes, so unfortunately, there is no recipe for that, at least not that I know, right? You just need to understand that it requires a good mix of both areas, right? When we talk about extrinsic motivation, we talk about transactional relationships, right? When we seek benefit that is external to us, money, status, awards, those are very important. We don't like to work for free and we like to get awarded for our performance. And at the same time, we know that we need a good mix of intrinsic value-driven factors as well. And when we talk about intrinsic motivation, we talk about things that we feel are enjoyable to us. We feel that we have this sense of satisfaction, fulfillment, right? Now, we know that we're craving intrinsic motivation because it connects to our basic needs. Now, there were smart people who were analyzing this for decades. We know that in order to tap into intrinsic motivation, we need to give people a sense of control, a sense of autonomy, a sense of I am in charge of my own performance, my own decisions. We need to give them development, right? We're craving for what Pink calls mastery. We're craving to be a better version of ourselves. Every single one of us, doesn't matter where you work, doesn't matter which industry, doesn't matter how old you are, right? So we have to have the sense that while I'm in this job, while I'm at this company, I'm progressing, right? I'm growing. And we need a certain mixture of purpose, connecting my work to something larger, to something that is more meaningful than just, this particular Excel sheet I'm just working on, and relatedness. Relatedness, I have to be in a social sphere, in a social connection that feels enjoyable, that feels meaningful to me.
And now, we would have a ton of more questions, and especially what we would love to hear from you is, how do you recommend companies support first-time management during this transition into leadership roles? And I know that you have specialized on that. So maybe this last question you also take into sharing where can listeners find you, and also how you would approach that or recommend that for companies who are desperately looking how to turn their managers into leaders.
Yeah, sure. So the number one advice that I can give companies that are promoting people into managerial roles is to guide them. You have to give them guidance. Really, that's number one. People were likely never told how to lead, and you have to acknowledge that, and you have to do something for that. If you have managers who can coach your first-time managers, let them coach them. If you have a personal department for that internally, give them resources to do that. If you can hire an external expert, do that. Right now, obviously, I'm in this business of joining companies and working with them. And I do believe that, in fact, there are a lot of benefits when getting an external person into the company and not doing it internally. I won't go into details here, but that's really not the point. The point is that senior managers have to acknowledge that there is this lack of leadership, practical leadership knowledge and training, and they have to cater for it. Now, what do? We at CNTRD, we engage in long-term coaching, right? I work on a long-term basis with founders, senior executives, but also middle managers. And our flagship program, in fact, the Leadership Accelerator, is a year-long leadership development journey that covers a lot of the topics we discussed today, in fact. And it's a very, very interesting and intriguing combination of keynotes and workshops and coaching and expert sessions with renowned industry experts. We're really taking managers through a whole year journey in order to adjust both their mindset, as we mentioned earlier, and really give them the practical leadership tools they need in order to know how to develop people, how to lead them, and how to focus on their performance, not only on yours. By the way, next group is starting in January. Whoever wants to reach out, you're more than welcome.
We will add the link to our show notes.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you
many
very,
of our
very much.
listeners will be very interested on where they can find you. Stanislaw, for the time being, thank you very much for these insights. That was very valuable and interesting points. Thank you for being on our show, and see you next time.
Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
This was another episode of Follow the Gradient.
And now we would love to hear from you. How did you like it? What should we improve? Do you have any suggestions, ideas, or dream podcast guests? Please let us know.
Thank you, and see you again next week.